My son didn't talk to me in 25 years, but he invited me to Thanksgiving after I got rich. I am George, a talented chef, abandoned by my son Mark and his mother Susan because they thought my work was beneath them. 25 years later, my son has returned, begging for help. He thinks he's getting money, but the Thanksgiving gift I have prepared for him is not a check. It's revenge, and this revenge, I have spent my entire life preparing for it. The phone rang, its shrill sound a blade cutting through the silence of my kitchen. It was an old number, one I hadn't seen in a quarter century. It was Mark's number. He hadn't spoken to me in 25 years, not since he and his mother left, claiming my culinary dreams were a pathetic waste of time. But just last week, my name was all over the local New Orleans news, splashed across every paper, local chef wins $5 million prize. And suddenly, Mark had time for his father. The irony was so bitter, it made my stomach churn. I let the phone ring one more time, gathering myself. I would answer. Not because I yearned to reconnect, but because after all this time, my carefully laid plan was finally beginning. What would you do if you were in my place? His call took me back, not just in memory but in sensation, to the day my life shattered. It was a Monday, 25 years ago. The New Orleans heat hung heavy, but a chill filled my house as Susan, my wife, methodically packed her suitcases. "You're a failure, George," she'd said, her voice sharp as a butcher's knife. 45 years old, and all you have is a failing diner and a dream that'll never come true. I'd stood in the doorway, a ghost in my own home, watching my life get folded and tucked away. Mark, our 18-year-old son, had been there too, his silence a louder betrayal than his mother's words. He had always been my little sous chef, my shadow in the kitchen, but that day he chose her corner office over my humble kitchen. "Mom's right," he'd finally said, his voice cold and final. "Maybe if you'd tried harder, been more successful, none of this would have happened." The words echoed in my empty house long after they left, a bitter seasoning in the silent meals I cooked for myself. For months, the house felt like a tomb. The familiar smells of simmering garlic and baking bread gave way to the scent of dust and unlived life. I tried to call Mark, to send him birthday cards, to explain, but my messages went unanswered. My letters came back unopened. The loneliness settled into my bones like the damp, heavy air of a Louisiana summer, a weight I thought would crush me. But one morning as I sat at my empty kitchen table, staring at a single, untouched plate of scrambled eggs, I made a decision. They had called me a failure, but a chef never gives up. A chef learns from their mistakes, adjusts the recipe, and tries again. I wouldn't let their words define me. I would not let them win. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew I would build a life so full, so rich, so successful, they would have no choice but to see the man I had become, even if they were too blind to see the man I always was. It was time to find a new recipe, a new life. They had defined me by my failures, but a chef, like a phoenix, learns to rise from the ashes. I sold the diner, not out of defeat, but as a symbolic act of severing ties with the past. With the small sum from the sale, I didn't chase the big flashy dreams Susan and Mark had wanted. Instead, I started a small, high-end catering business, operating right out of my home kitchen in New Orleans. The work was grueling and lonely, but it was mine. I was cooking for the love of it, not for the validation of others. The catering business wasn't an overnight success. For years, I scraped by, my only company, the spices in my rack, and the whisper of the wind through the live oaks outside. But slowly, steadily, my reputation began to grow. My gumbo, with its dark, complex roux that took hours to perfect, became legendary. My jambalaya, rich with andouille sausage and Gulf shrimp, was the talk of every gala and private event I catered. I lived a quiet, simple life, reinvesting my modest profits and saving every penny. My satisfaction wasn't found in expensive cars or designer clothes, but in the look on a customer's face after their first bite, a small, honest moment of pure joy. It was a life built not on greed, but on integrity and a quiet defiance against the narrative they had written for me. The years blurred into a quarter century. I had found peace, a kind of simple contentment in my routine. Then came the American Chef's Challenge, a national culinary competition I entered on a whim. The journey was grueling, a test of skill and a battle of wills. But my hands, weathered from years of perfecting my craft, did not fail me. My dishes, infused with the rich history and soul of New Orleans, captivated the judges. I won. The prize money, a staggering $5 million, was more than I had ever dreamed of. The story of the quiet New Orleans chef who had triumphed against all odds became a local sensation. I never thought anyone outside the culinary world would notice, but that story was a bridge, a fragile one, stretching across 25 years of silence. It was the only reason I could imagine for the phone to finally ring. The phone had barely been to my ear for a moment when the voice began. "Dad," he said, his tone so full of manufactured warmth it made my stomach churn. "You know it's been a while, but with Thanksgiving coming up, we'd love to have you over." The phone call had ended, but the silence that followed was different now. It wasn't the silence of emptiness, but the charged silence of a chef preparing for a final, crucial meal. Mark's casual, "It's been a while" greeting had a price tag, and I intended to find out exactly how much he thought I was worth. My revenge would not be a single dish, but a full-course tasting menu of justice. Over the next few days, I began making quiet inquiries, a slow, methodical investigation into the life of my son. My catering business had given me something invaluable over the years, a vast, discreet network of people who loved food and the city it came from. Restaurant owners, suppliers, vendors, even journalists. I knew them all. The Mark, the papers, called the King of Creole Cuisine, was a charlatan. The whispers began almost immediately. A new, exclusive bistro would open, receive a glowing, uncritical review from Mark, and then mysteriously, a shell corporation would receive a consulting fee. His scathing, career-ruining reviews, I learned, were not for truly bad food, but for the defiant, small-time chefs who refused to play his game. He didn't review food, he reviewed bank accounts. My investigation was a painstaking process, but my years of discipline in the kitchen served me well. I compiled everything: restaurant payrolls, public records of his shell companies, and interviews with chefs he had destroyed. My revenge wasn't going to be about money. It was going to be about justice. My tasting menu of justice was ready. I had a full dossier of Mark's deceit, bank records, public documents from his shell companies, screenshots of his social media posts, and even signed affidavits from 2 small-time chefs whose careers he had systematically destroyed. Now, all I needed was a messenger. I thought of a young, earnest investigative journalist named Sarah Jensen, who had done a fair and honest piece on my diner years ago for the New Orleans Chronicle. She was tough, ethical, and more importantly, she knew the food scene. I called her and arranged a discreet meeting, telling her I had a story she wouldn't believe. Sarah met me in a quiet corner of a coffee shop, her face a mask of professional skepticism. "This is a serious accusation against a very powerful man, George," she said, tapping the thick manila folder I had placed on the table between us. "If this isn't airtight, he could sue this paper into oblivion." "It's airtight," I said, a grim confidence in my voice. "He's not a food critic, Sarah. He's a mob boss in a tailored suit." She opened the folder and began to read. Her skepticism slowly gave way to shock, then to a quiet fury. As she scrolled through my digital files, her eyes widened. "The paper trail is incredible," she whispered, shaking her head. "He's been running a protection racket, essentially. He takes out the honest competition and uses the leverage to get kickbacks from the big players." When she looked up, her expression was one of outrage. "This is a huge story, George. It could win me a Pulitzer." "I have one more request," I said. "I want you to release the story on Thanksgiving. I've been invited to their home for dinner. It would be poetic." Sarah smiled, a chilling professional smile. "It would make for the most unforgettable Thanksgiving headline in the history of this city. Consider it done." She promised me complete anonymity, saying she would use an anonymous source to protect me. As I walked out of the coffee shop, a strange sense of calm settled over me. The appetizer was prepared. The main course was on its way. The weeks that followed were filled with a quiet anticipation, like the long, slow simmer of a gumbo base before the main ingredients are added. Thanksgiving Day dawned, cold and crisp in New Orleans. I spent the morning in my kitchen, not out of obligation but out of a need to ground myself in what was real. I prepared my crawfish étouffée, a dish that was a part of me, filled with history and a certain honest complexity that I knew would be utterly absent at my son's table. I drove across town, away from the historic, soulful streets I called home, towards a newer, more sterile part of the city. Mark's house was a monument to new money, all vinyl siding and perfect, unlived, in landscaping. A wreath hung on the door, but it looked less like a symbol of welcome and more like a designer accessory. Mark opened the door, a smile plastered on his face. "Dad, you made it." His hug was a hollow gesture, a practiced motion that felt less like an embrace and more like a social requirement. Behind him, Susan appeared. She looked older, her face etched with the kind of weariness that comes from a life of pretense. But her eyes still held that same cold, calculating glint I remembered. "George," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, "how wonderful to see you. You look so prosperous." The word hung in the air, a vulgar price tag attached to my newfound presence in their lives. I stepped into a living room that felt less like a home and more like a showroom. The furniture was expensive but impersonal, the television oversized, and the air smelled of store-bought cranberry sauce and expensive potpourri, not the rich, complex aromas of a real Thanksgiving meal. I was an intruder in a life I had no connection to. The conversation at dinner was a careful dance. They asked polite surface-level questions about my life, my work, my plans. But beneath every sentence, I could feel the real question simmering. "Where's the money? How much do you have?" Mark, with the flair of a true performer, carved the turkey with theatrical flourish, while Susan kept my wineglass full, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. I cut my turkey into precise pieces, listening to them talk about their friends and their expensive vacations, a world so far removed from my own that it felt like a different planet. But I wasn't just a guest, I was an observer. I was a judge. With every forced laugh, every fake compliment, every glance towards the front door as if expecting a delivery of my good fortune, I saw through their facade. They weren't a family. They were a business transaction waiting to happen. The dinner was a prelude, and I knew the main course was coming. I was calm, collected, a quiet judge in a courtroom of my own making, knowing that I held all the power, and their pleasantries were nothing more than a prelude to their downfall. The conversation was a delicate dance, but I knew the music was about to change. As Susan cleared the dessert plates and brought out the coffee, the pretense of a happy family reunion began to melt away, replaced by the cold, hard reality of their desperation. Mark leaned forward, his voice shifting from casual chatter to the slick, rehearsed tone of a salesman. "Dad," he began, his eyes bright with a hunger I hadn't seen in 25 years, "I know you've had some incredible good fortune. And honestly, it's not a coincidence that it happened right when I'm on the cusp of something truly revolutionary." He pulled out his phone, the screen already open to a meticulously designed slideshow. "It's a food tech platform called Cuisine Connect. We're talking about disrupting the entire industry, Dad. It uses AI to connect independent chefs with high-paying clients, and blockchain integration for fully transparent, unbiased reviews. The projections are mind-blowing returns of 500% in 18 months. We're on the verge of becoming the next Google, but for gourmet food." Susan sat beside him, her hand resting on my arm, the gesture more of a pressure than a comfort. "Your prize money, George," she chimed in, her voice low and conspiratorial. "It's a sign that this is meant to be. We just need a little seed money, a little over $500,000 for the final push." I listened calmly, a ghost in their living room, sipping my coffee. The numbers he threw at me were fantastical, the projections impossible. I saw through the jargon to the empty promises beneath. "What's the user acquisition strategy beyond the initial seed round, Mark?" I asked, my voice flat. "Have you conducted a competitive analysis on existing platforms like OpenTable? What's your long-term revenue model, besides a quick acquisition?" Mark's confident smile faltered. He launched into a defensive rant, filled with more buzzwords and vague assurances. Susan's agitation grew, her manicured fingers tapping impatiently on the arm of her chair. They were desperate, and the pressure was palpable. "The other investors are big time, Dad," Mark said, his tone no longer a salesman's pitch, but a frantic plea. "But they want to keep it quiet for now." "We need to move fast, George," Susan added, her voice laced with a subtle guilt trip. "The window closes after the holidays." This is a one-of-a-kind opportunity for the family, for our family. The irony was so thick I could taste it. But before they could apply any more pressure, a sharp, authoritative knock came from the front door, a sound that cut through the room like a perfectly sharpened blade. The authoritative knock at the door cut through Mark's rehearsed pitch like a blade through a perfectly baked souffle. He frowned, his frustration with my questions momentarily forgotten. "I wasn't expecting anyone," he mumbled, walking to the door. Susan and I trailed behind him, a strange, silent procession. Mark opened the door to a man in a dark overcoat holding a thick manila envelope. "Mark Brooks?" the man asked. Mark's face turned pale as he accepted the papers. "You've been served," the man said, before turning and disappearing into the cold night. Mark stared at the documents, his hands trembling. This can't be right," he whispered. "What is it, my darling?" Susan peered over his shoulder. Her eyes widened as she read the words. "It's a lawsuit," she said, her voice a sharp intake of breath. "Multiple lawsuits. From the investors. They found you." Just then, as Mark's face drained of all color, the television in the living room, which had been playing softly in the background, cut to a live breaking news report. The face of a reporter, Sarah Jensen, appeared on screen. She was standing outside a familiar building downtown. "We're here tonight with a breaking story that will rock the local culinary scene," she began, her voice crisp and professional. "A famous New Orleans food critic, Mark Brooks, is currently under investigation for a widespread bribery and kickback scheme, allegedly using his public influence to strong-arm small businesses and destroy the careers of honest chefs." Mark and Susan stared at the screen, their mouths agape. "This can't be happening," Mark whispered, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. "How did they know? How could they have found out?" Susan was on the verge of tears, her hands trembling as she grabbed Mark's arm. "They're saying you're a fraud!" she shrieked. "This is a lie! It's all a lie!" The news report continued, showing screenshots of Mark's fake shell companies and interviews with several chefs he had destroyed. According to an anonymous source who provided a vast and detailed dossier of evidence, the reporter continued, "Brooks was allegedly blackmailing local restaurant owners to fund his own lavish lifestyle and a failing new app he had been pitching to investors." Mark turned to me, his eyes wide with terror and confusion. "Dad, what's going on?" I simply took another sip of my coffee, the warm, bitter liquid, a stark contrast to the cold, bitter reality that was unfolding around them. The news report continued to play, its crisp, professional voice narrating the end of Mark's world. Mark and Susan stood frozen, their faces a tableau of sheer, unadulterated horror. They were like two lost children, completely unequipped to handle the consequences of their own actions. The only sound in the room was the low hum of the television, a cold narrator of their public demise. I set my coffee cup down with a soft click that echoed in the silent, tense room. The time for pretense was over. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice calm, almost casual, mimicking Mark's earlier question to me. "It's what you asked for, Mark. You said you wanted to reconnect. You said you wanted to talk about a business opportunity. This," I gestured to the television, "is my response." Their heads snapped towards me, a slow, dawning horror in their eyes. Susan was the first to find her voice, a sharp, disbelieving cry. "What are you talking about, George? This is a lie." "It has to be. We'll sue them." "You're right, Susan," I said, a grim confidence in my voice. "You will sue, and you will lose. Because the evidence, all of it, is real. And it was I who provided it." A stunned silence filled the room. The color drained from Mark's face entirely, leaving it a sickly gray. You did this?" he stammered, his eyes wide with a terror I had never seen before. "But why? How did you even—" "I don't understand." "I don't expect you to," I said, rising slowly to my feet. 25 years ago you left me because you thought my life was pathetic. You didn't want a father. You wanted a rich man. You called me after 25 years of silence, not because you wanted a family, but because you heard I won that culinary competition. You thought you could come back now and get a piece of a success you had no part in building. You have no idea what I've done in those 25 years. While you were busy playing the big shot, I was quietly building a network, a reputation for honesty and integrity. And when you called, I knew exactly what to do. I was a man on a mission. and I used the same meticulous care I used to perfect a gumbo to unravel your web of lies. Susan's face twisted into a grotesque mask of rage and fear. You're a monster, George. After all we've been through, how could you? After all we've been through? I repeated her words, a bitter smile on my lips. I learned from the best. I learned what it means to be a disappointment. I learned what it means to be selfish. I'm just giving you a taste of your own medicine. Dad, please! Mark's terror turned into a frantic, desperate plea. I can fix this. We can still hire lawyers. We can make this all go away with your money. Please, I'm your son. No, I said, my voice cutting through his desperation like a cleaver through soft meat. You stopped being my son the day you left. The man you're talking to isn't that same pathetic chef you abandoned. This is my Thanksgiving gift to you, Mark. A lesson in accountability. A debt 25 years in the making, finally paid in full. I walked to the front door, leaving them to stare in stunned silence, their carefully constructed world crumbling around them. I walked to the front door, leaving them to stare in stunned silence, their carefully constructed world crumbling around them. The door closed behind me with a soft click, cutting off their pleas and protests. The New Orleans air, cold and crisp, was a welcome relief from the suffocating heat of their living room. I didn't feel a surge of triumph as I walked to my car. Instead, a quiet sadness settled over me, a sense of finality. This wasn't a celebration, it was a necessary act of surgery. The cancer of their deceit had been cut out of my life, but the wound it left would never fully heal. The drive home was quiet. The streets, lined with holiday lights, twinkled in my rearview mirror, a mocking contrast to the darkness I had just left behind. I thought of the years of loneliness, the unanswered calls, the returned birthday cards. I thought of my own quiet battles, the long nights spent perfecting a recipe, and the silent satisfaction of a job well done. The George they saw tonight, the man who had delivered justice, was a man I had spent a lifetime building from the fragments of the man they had destroyed. I pulled into my driveway, the engine of my Honda humming with a reliable rhythm. My modest home felt like a sanctuary, a warm, honest refuge from a world of lies. Back in their home, the peace I felt was a luxury they could no longer afford. The silence after my departure was deafening. Susan was the first to break it, her voice a frantic, high-pitched shriek. What do we do? We have to call a lawyer. Mark, call your lawyer. Mark, however, stood frozen, the legal papers still clutched in his trembling hands. They won't answer, he stammered, his eyes wide with a newfound understanding of his powerlessness. He was right. He frantically dialed a number, only to be met with a cold, robotic voice, informing him that the number had been temporarily disconnected. He tried another, and another. Each one was met with a busy signal, or a direct hang-up. The news had spread like wildfire. The world that had once celebrated him was now turning its back. Susan, ever the manipulator, grabbed her phone, her fingers flying across the screen. I'll call my friends. My bridge club. They have connections. They'll know someone. But her calls went unanswered. The friends she had cultivated for years, the ones who had enjoyed her lavish parties and her expensive gifts, were now ghosts. Their social standing, the very currency they had traded in for so long, had been rendered worthless. The beautiful, soulless house, once a symbol of their success, now felt like a cage, its walls closing in. The reality of their situation began to sink in, a cold, hard truth that was far more painful than any lie they had ever told. They were alone. They had burned every bridge, ignored every cry for help from the one person who had truly cared, and now they were left with nothing but the smoldering wreckage of their lives. Days blurred into weeks, and weeks into months. Reports trickled in through New Orleans' tight-knit network of gossip and genuine concern. The story had legs, as they say in the news business, and it ran far and wide. The lawsuits from Mark's investors, armed with the evidence I had provided, were swift and brutal. The judge showed no mercy for someone who had systematically destroyed small businesses and stolen from hard-working people to finance a lifestyle of lies. The media frenzy, fueled by Sarah Jensen's groundbreaking investigative piece, ensured that Mark's name became synonymous with greed and deceit. His reputation, the very thing he had built his life on, was gone. My friend from the catering business, a kind man named Lewis, stopped by one afternoon. "George," he said, shaking his head, Did you hear? The bank took their house, the one he was so proud of. The lawyers are freezing all their accounts. Lost everything. I nodded, stirring a pot of my famous gumbo. It wasn't news to me, but hearing it out loud still felt surreal. But Mark's situation was arguably worse. The public outrage, sparked by the discovery of his scams, had struck a nerve that his business dealings never could. People could understand a bad business deal, but a food critic preying on the very soul of the city, its honest chefs and vibrant culinary culture, was a betrayal too deep to forgive. But for me, the spring that followed was a revelation. I discovered that freedom from resentment was like recovering from a long illness. The bitterness and loneliness I had carried for 25 years had lifted, leaving room for a kind of peace I never thought I would find. I still lived in the same modest home, but it no longer felt like a monument to my solitude. It felt like a sanctuary, a place where I could finally live a life of my own choosing. I had enough money to live anywhere, do anything, but I discovered that true satisfaction came from different sources than I had expected. The revenge, the justice, had been a necessary act of closure, but it had not been the source of my happiness. Instead, I decided to use the prize money from the culinary competition for a purpose that was, in its own way, a testament to the man I had become. I purchased a small building in a vibrant, artistic corner of the French Quarter and began renovating it. My new project was a culinary school for underprivileged kids in New Orleans. I called it the Second Chance Kitchen. It was a place where young people, who had the fire and the passion I once had, could learn to cook, to create, to build a life with their own two hands, without having to navigate a world built on lies and deceit. One afternoon, as I was teaching a class of a dozen bright-eyed teenagers how to make a perfect roux, I saw a young girl named Lily, her face covered in flour, her eyes full of a determination that reminded me of myself. I realized that my legacy wasn't in the revenge I had delivered, but in the lessons I was now teaching. I was building something real, something that would last. The pain of the past was no longer a weight on my shoulders. It was a lesson, a part of my recipe for a life well lived. The school, my second chance kitchen, became my new home, my new life, my new family. The laughter of the children, the smell of flour and yeast, the quiet satisfaction of a perfectly seasoned dish, these things filled the voids that revenge had only temporarily patched. I had found peace, not in the fall of Mark and Susan, but in the rise of a dozen new chefs who had the fire and the passion I once had. I often think about my journey. For 25 years, I was living one of those bitter betrayal stories you hear about. I was the victim, defined by my past, my heart a tomb for a family that had abandoned me. The day I got my revenge, I thought I was finally free, but freedom didn't come from their downfall. It came much later, in this kitchen, surrounded by these children. I realized that for a long time, I wanted to be like God, delivering my own judgment upon them. But I was just a man, and the burden of that judgment was too heavy to carry. I found peace when I chose to let go, when I chose to forgive. A gift I now understand comes only from God. My story, like so many betrayal stories, is a testament to the fact that money can fix many things, but it cannot fix a broken heart. Mark and Susan, with all their ambition and greed, chased after a kind of wealth that was fragile and fleeting. They built a house of cards, and it took only a simple act of honesty to bring it all down. They lost everything they had, not because I took it from them, but because it was never truly theirs to begin with. Their currency was lies, and lies, in the end, are always a poor investment. I hope that someday they will also find a path to forgiveness, and I pray to God that they find a way to rebuild their lives with a foundation of truth, something they have never known. I learned that true strength is not in getting even, but in moving forward. It's in using your pain not as a weapon, but as a compass. It's in building a life so rich in purpose that the wounds of the past can no longer define you. This is my lesson. This is my advice. Don't let your betrayal stories become your entire story. Use them as a lesson. Use them as a compass. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it gives you some food for thought. There are so many similar betrayal stories out there, and I know many of you have your own experiences. I pray that you will find peace and happiness in your own lives, no matter what you have been through. This is my final wish for you. What would you do if you found yourself in the middle of one of these betrayal stories? Let me know in the comments below.